The Atlanta sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, turning the tarmac into a shimmering sheet of heat. Inside Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, the air hummed with the usual chaos, rolling suitcases, echoing announcements, and the low murmur of 1,000 conversations. Among the crowd, a woman walked with a quiet confidence that seemed to part the sea of travelers around her. She wore a simple navy blazer over a white blouse, dark slacks, and comfortable shoes, clothes chosen for function, not flair. Her carry-on was light, just a small leather bag slung over one shoulder. She moved with purpose, but there was a deep weariness in her eyes, the kind that comes not from lack of sleep but from carrying invisible weight. She'd just wrapped up a week-long assignment that had tested her in ways few would understand. Undercover work wasn't glamorous. It meant long hours, constant vigilance, and the emotional toll of pretending to be someone you weren't, all while watching for the smallest slip that could blow your cover. Now all she wanted was to get home, take off her shoes, and breathe in a space where she didn't have to perform. Her flight to Washington, D.C. was boarding in 10 minutes. Business class, a rare perk approved by her supervisor after the intensity of the operation. She deserved it. At the gate, she handed over her boarding pass with a small nod to the agent, who scanned it without looking up. She stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool blast of conditioned air a welcome relief. The cabin was already half full. She found her window seat, 12A, and slid in, stowing her bag neatly under the seat in front of her. She buckled her seatbelt, leaned her head back, and closed her eyes for just a moment, letting the low drone of the aircraft systems wash over her like a lullaby. The man in the aisle seat arrived a few minutes later. He was in his late 50s with thinning hair combed over a pink scalp and a crisp button-down shirt tucked into khakis. He carried a leather briefcase and a look of mild irritation, as if the world had personally inconvenienced him by existing. When he saw her already seated, his eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't say anything at first, just gave a curt grunt as he squeezed past her to take his seat by the aisle. She offered a polite "excuse me" as she shifted her legs to give him room, but he didn't respond. The plane pushed back from the gate, and the flight attendants began their safety demonstration. She listened with half an ear, her mind already drifting toward the quiet apartment waiting for her in D.C. The soft couch, the kettle whistling on the stove, the silence. But then she felt it, a shift in the air beside her. The man was watching her, not casually, not out of curiosity, but with a kind of focused suspicion, like he was trying to solve a puzzle only he could see. At first, she ignored it. People stared sometimes on planes and elevators and grocery stores. Sometimes it was admiration, sometimes confusion, sometimes just boredom. She'd learned long ago not to take it personally. But this felt different. His gaze wasn't idle. It was probing, judgmental. She kept her eyes forward, pretending to read the safety card, though she knew every word by heart. As the plane taxied down the runway, the man leaned slightly toward the flight attendant passing by. "Excuse me," he said, his voice just loud enough to carry. "Is everything okay with this seat assignment?" The flight attendant, a woman with warm brown eyes and a practiced smile, paused. "Everything looks in order, sir. Is there an issue?" He glanced pointedly at the woman beside him. I don't know. She seems out of place." "Are you sure she's supposed to be in business class?" The flight attendant's smile didn't waver, but her eyes flickered with something, annoyance maybe, or pity. "Sir, all passengers in this cabin have valid tickets. If you have concerns about your seat, I can check availability in another section after takeoff." He huffed, muttering something under his breath as the plane lifted off the ground. The woman kept her expression neutral, but inside her stomach tightened. She'd heard that tone before. The coded language, the implication that someone didn't belong. It was never about the ticket. It was never about the seat. It was about who she was, what she looked like, the assumptions people made before she'd even spoken a word. She'd faced it in high school when teachers doubted her intelligence. In college when classmates assumed she'd gotten in through some special program. At job interviews where hiring managers asked if she was really comfortable in a high-pressure, mostly white environment. And now at 35,000 feet, in a cabin paid for with her own hard-earned money, she was being questioned again, silently, smugly, by a man who hadn't even bothered to learn her name. The plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers began shifting, reaching for overhead bins, pulling out books or laptops. She stayed still, eyes fixed on the clouds outside. She wanted to disappear into them, just float away, weightless and unseen. But the man wasn't done. A few minutes later, he flagged down another flight attendant, this one younger, with a name tag that read Maria. He spoke in a stage whisper, but his words carried clearly down the aisle. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said, leaning forward with an air of false concern. "But that woman next to me, she's acting strange. Won't make eye contact, keeps looking around like she's nervous. And honestly," he lowered his voice, though not enough, "does she even look like she belongs here?" Maria's expression remained professional, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, I assure you all passengers undergo the same security screening. If you're uncomfortable, I can speak with the purser about reseating you." "She's the one making people uncomfortable," he insisted, glancing around as if expecting support. A few nearby passengers looked away quickly. One woman across the aisle frowned but said nothing. The woman in 12A finally turned her head. Just slightly. Enough to meet his eyes. Her gaze was calm, steady, not angry, not defensive, but firm. It was the look of someone who had seen too much to be rattled by small-mindedness, yet still carried the quiet fire of someone who refused to be erased. He blinked, startled by the directness, and looked away first. Maria stepped in smoothly. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to keep your comments to yourself. We do not tolerate discrimination on this aircraft. If this continues, we'll have to report it to the captain." He muttered something about just being cautious and slumped back in his seat, arms crossed. But his eyes kept darting toward her, restless and resentful. She turned back to the window. Her heart was beating faster now, not from fear, but from the familiar, exhausting weight of having to prove her right to exist. In this seat, in this job, in this world. She thought about pulling out her badge right then, just to watch his face fall. But she didn't, not yet, because this wasn't about him. It was about her peace, and she wasn't going to let him steal that from her mid-flight. Still, she kept one hand resting lightly on her carry-on. Not out of fear, but readiness. She knew who she was. She knew what she carried. And if he pushed too far, he'd find out too. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, blue, vast, indifferent. The plane soared on, carrying hundreds of lives, each with their own stories, their own battles. Hers was just one, but it was hers, and no narrow-minded stranger in a khaki pant was going to make her feel small in it. She took a slow breath, exhaled, and let the hum of the engines fill the silence. She wasn't here to perform. She wasn't here to justify. She was here to go home, and that was enough. The flight settled into its cruising rhythm, engines humming steadily, cabin lights dimmed just enough to signal it was time to relax. Most passengers leaned into the calm. Some scrolled through movies on their screens, others dozed with neck pillows wedged awkwardly. A few whispered to travel companions. But in seat 12A, there was no relaxation. The tension from the man beside her hadn't faded. It had only grown heavier, like storm clouds gathering low on the horizon. He shifted in his seat again, this time with exaggerated discomfort, as if her very presence made the leather upholstery unbearable. He cleared his throat loudly, then pulled out his phone and began typing with sharp, angry jabs at the screen. Every few seconds he'd glance sideways at her, his expression a mix of suspicion and irritation. She kept her eyes on the clouds outside, pretending not to notice, but every muscle in her body was alert. She'd been trained to read people, micro-expressions, body language, shifts in tone, and this man was broadcasting hostility like a radio tower. A flight attendant passed by with a drink cart, offering coffee, water, juice. When she reached their row, the man didn't even look at the options. Instead, he leaned forward and said, voice low but edged with urgency, "Can I speak with you for a second?" "Privately?" The attendant, Maria again, paused. She'd dealt with difficult passengers before. Drunks, complainers, people who thought first class meant they owned the sky. But this felt different. There was a nervous energy in his voice, like he was trying to sound reasonable while actually spiraling. "Of course, sir," she said, stepping slightly into the aisle to give them space. "What's on your mind?" He lowered his voice further, though not enough to keep the woman in 12A from hearing every word. "That woman next to me. I don't feel safe. She hasn't said a word since we boarded. Just stares out the window like she's planning something. And look at how she's dressed, too neat, too calm. It's suspicious." Maria kept her expression neutral, but her eyes flicked toward the woman in 12A. She saw someone composed, professional, clearly exhausted, but not threatening. Nothing about her screamed danger, unless your idea of danger was a black woman sitting quietly in a seat she paid for. "Sir," Maria said carefully, "everyone reacts to flights differently. Some people like to rest, some like to talk. There's nothing unusual about her behavior." "But she's in business class," he insisted, voice rising slightly. "I've flown this route dozens of times. People like her, they're usually in coach. Something's off." Maria's polite mask didn't slip, but her tone hardened just a fraction. "Sir, we don't assign seats based on appearance. All our passengers are treated equally. If you're uncomfortable, I can check if there's an open seat in another section." He waved that off like it was beneath him. "It's not about the seat. It's about safety. What if she's carrying something? What if she's not who she says she is?" At this, the woman in 12A finally turned her head. Not sharply, not angrily, just slowly, like someone waking from a light nap. She looked at him directly, her eyes calm but unblinking. "Is there something you'd like to ask me?" she said, her voice quiet but clear enough for nearby passengers to hear. He flinched, caught off guard by her speaking at all. For a second, he looked like he might back down, but then his pride kicked in. He straightened in his seat and said, "I'm just saying it's strange. You don't act like you belong here." A few rows ahead, a young man paused his movie. Two women across the aisle exchanged glances. The air in the cabin had changed, thickened with unease. She didn't raise her voice, didn't scowl. She simply said, "I have a ticket. I went through security. I followed every rule." "What exactly is strange about that?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no real answer, just a feeling, a prejudice dressed up as concern. But instead of admitting that, he turned back to Maria. "See? She's being defensive. That's not normal." Maria took a breath. She'd been trained to de-escalate, to keep peace at all costs. But she also knew when someone was crossing a line. "Sir," she said firmly, "I'm going to ask you again to keep your comments to yourself. Making assumptions about other passengers based on how they look is not acceptable. If this continues, I'll need to inform the captain." He muttered something under his breath, something that sounded like political correctness gone mad, and slumped back in his seat, arms crossed like a child denied dessert. Maria gave the woman in 12A a small, apologetic nod before moving on with the drink cart. But the damage was done. The quiet peace of the flight had been shattered. Minutes passed. The woman kept her eyes forward, but she could feel the man's gaze on her like a physical weight. Then, without warning, he stood up. "Excuse me," he announced loudly, not to her but to the cabin at large. "I need to speak with someone in charge." He walked toward the front of the business cabin where another flight attendant was organizing meal trays. He spoke quickly, gesturing back toward seat 12A. The attendant listened, then shook her head gently, saying something too soft to hear. But the man wasn't satisfied. He raised his voice. "I'm telling you, she's acting suspicious. She won't talk, she won't look at anyone. What if she's hiding something? You need to check her bag." Now more passengers were paying attention. A man in a suit paused mid-bite of his pretzel. A woman with headphones lowered them around her neck. Someone near the window discreetly pulled out their phone and started recording. The lead flight attendant, the purser, finally came over. Older, with silver streaks in her hair and a no-nonsense posture, she carried an air of authority that silenced the man before she even spoke. "What seems to be the issue, sir?" she asked, voice calm but firm. He repeated his claims. Out of place, nervous behavior, doesn't belong. Each phrase dripping with coded language that everyone in the cabin understood, even if no one said it aloud. The purser listened without interrupting. When he finished, she turned slightly and looked at the woman in 12A. Their eyes met. In that glance, there was no suspicion, only recognition. The purser had seen this before. "Too many times, ma'am," she said gently. "Is everything all right?" The woman nodded. "I'm fine. I just want to get home." The purser turned back to the man. "Sir, this passenger has done nothing wrong. You're making unfounded accusations based on her appearance. That's not only inappropriate, it's a violation of our airline's policy." He sputtered. "I'm just looking out for everyone's safety." "No," the purser said, her voice dropping to a level that brooked no argument. "You're making someone feel unwelcome because of what she looks like. That ends now, sit down, and if you say another word to her about this passenger, I will have you removed from this flight the moment we land." He opened his mouth to protest, but something in her stare stopped him. With a huff, he turned and marched back to his seat, muttering about rights and overreaction. But he wasn't done. As he passed the woman in 12A, he leaned in just enough for only her to hear. "You think you're slick," he whispered. "But people like you always get caught." She didn't react, didn't flinch, just kept her eyes straight ahead, her breathing steady. Inside, though, a quiet fire burned, not of anger, but of resolve. She'd spent her life being doubted, questioned, followed in stores, pulled over for routine checks, told she was too aggressive when she spoke up or not a team player when she stayed quiet. She'd worked twice as hard to get half the credit. And now, thousands of feet in the air, she was being treated like a threat simply for existing in a space someone decided she didn't deserve. She thought about flashing her badge right then, ending it with one swift motion. But she held back. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew the truth. This wasn't really about her. It was about him, about the fear and ignorance he carried like luggage. And sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was let that fear hang in the air, exposed for everyone to see. Around her, the cabin remained tense. But something else was happening too. A woman 2 rows back gave her a small, supportive smile. A man across the aisle nodded slightly as if to say, "I see you. I've got your back." Even the flight attendants moved with extra care near her seat, offering water, checking in with quiet kindness. She wasn't alone. Still, she kept one hand resting lightly on her carry-on. Not out of fear, but readiness, because she knew who she was. She knew the weight of the badge in her bag. And if he pushed one more time, if he crossed that final line, she wouldn't just defend herself. She'd remind him and everyone watching exactly who held the real authority. Outside, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden streaks across the clouds. The plane flew on, carrying its passengers toward their destinations, each with their own burdens, their own battles. Hers was just one. But it was hers, and she wouldn't let anyone make her feel small for carrying it. The cabin stayed quiet for a while after the man stomped back to his seat. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that follows a good meal or a shared laugh, but the heavy, watchful silence that comes after something ugly has been said out loud. People pretended to read, to nap, to fiddle with their seatbelts, but their eyes kept flicking toward row 12. No one wanted to stare outright, but everyone was paying attention. They'd all heard enough to know what was really going on. The woman in 12A kept her gaze fixed on the window. The clouds outside had thinned, revealing patches of land far below. Tiny squares of farmland, winding rivers like silver threads, highways that looked like pencil lines drawn by a child. She focused on those details, grounding herself in the vastness of the world beyond this metal tube. Up here, she was just one person among hundreds. But down there she mattered. Her work mattered, and she wouldn't let this moment shrink her. Beside her, the man shifted again. He pulled out his phone, tapped aggressively at the screen, then put it away. He drummed his fingers on the armrest. He sighed loudly as if burdened by some great injustice. Then, after several minutes of restless fidgeting, he stood up again. This time, he didn't go to the flight attendants. Instead, he turned to the passengers around him. First the man in 11C, then the woman in 13A, then a couple seated across the aisle. His voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was loud, urgent, almost theatrical. "Wouldn't you feel unsafe?" he asked, leaning toward the man in 11C who looked startled and quickly shook his head. "Look at how she's acting, like she's hiding something. She won't talk, won't make eye contact. I'm telling you, something's not right." The woman across the aisle frowned and pulled her headphones back on, turning her body away. The couple exchanged a glance and pretended to be deeply interested in their in-flight magazine. No one took his bait, but he didn't seem to care. He was performing now, for himself maybe, or for some imagined audience that agreed with him. He raised his voice a little more. "I mean, come on, be honest. Doesn't it seem weird to you? A person like that sitting up here in business class acting all quiet and secretive? What if she's got something in her bag? What if she's dangerous?" That did it. The woman in 12A turned her head slowly, not with anger, not with fear, but with a calm so steady it cut through the noise like a blade. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and low, carrying just enough to be heard without shouting, "if you have a concern, I suggest you voice it to the proper authorities once we land." Her tone wasn't confrontational. It was almost polite. But there was steel underneath it, quiet, unshakable steel. He scoffed, crossing his arms like a teenager caught in a lie. "Oh, and who are you? Some kind of agent?" She didn't smile, didn't blink, just looked at him for a long moment as if weighing whether he was worth the effort. Then with deliberate slowness, she reached into the inside pocket of her blazer. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. She pulled out a small leather wallet, black, worn at the edges from years of use. With one smooth motion, she flipped it open and held it up just enough for him and the passengers nearby to see. Inside, gleaming under the soft cabin lights, was a gold shield. Beneath it, bold letters spelled out 3-word Federal Bureau of Investigation. And below that, her photo, her name, her title, Special Agent. Time didn't stop, but it might as well have. The man's face went slack. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted from the badge to her face, then back to the badge, as if trying to convince himself it wasn't real. His hands, which had been gesturing wildly just seconds before, dropped to his sides like dead weight. The woman didn't say another word. She just held the badge there for a few seconds, long enough for the message to sink in, then closed the wallet and slipped it back into her pocket. The silence that followed was different this time. Not heavy, not tense, just stunned. A few rows back, someone let out a quiet wow. Another passenger actually smiled, a small, satisfied curve of the lips, like justice had just been served in miniature. The man who'd been targeted earlier in 11C gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod of respect. But the man in the aisle seat? He looked like he'd been slapped with ice water. His face flushed red, then drained to a sickly pale. He stumbled back a half step, bumping into the seat behind him. I didn't," he stammered. "I didn't know." She finally turned to face him fully. Her expression hadn't changed, still calm, still composed, but her eyes held something new now. Not anger, disappointment. The kind you feel when someone reveals their worst self in public and doesn't even realize how small they've made themselves. "You didn't know what?" she asked, voice still quiet. "That I had a right to be here? That I earned this seat? Or that judging someone by their skin is not only wrong, it's dangerous?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around as if searching for an escape, for someone to rescue him from the hole he'd dug, but no one met his eyes. Even the flight attendants, who had been watching from a distance, now turned away, giving him the ultimate punishment: indifference. He sank back into his seat like a deflated balloon. His shoulders hunched forward. He didn't look at her again. Didn't look at anyone. He just stared at his hands, which trembled slightly in his lap. She turned back to the window. Her heart was still beating fast, but not from fear, from clarity. She hadn't wanted to reveal herself. She never did. Her job wasn't about badges or authority. It was about protecting people, often from threats they never saw coming. But sometimes in moments like this, showing who she was wasn't about pride. It was about truth. About making sure the record was set straight, not just for her, but for everyone watching. Because someone else might be on a plane one day, minding their own business and face the same kind of baseless suspicion, and maybe, just maybe, they'd remember this moment. Remember that dignity doesn't need to shout. That truth speaks loudest when it's calm. A few minutes later, Maria, the flight attendant, walked by again. This time, she paused beside the woman's seat. She didn't say anything about the badge or the confrontation. She just leaned in slightly and said softly, "Can I get you anything? Water, tea?" The woman gave her a small, genuine smile. "Just water, please." "Thank you." Maria nodded, her eyes warm with quiet solidarity. As she walked away, she made a subtle signal to the purser at the front. A quick tap on her own wrist, the universal crew code for situation handled, but documented. The rest of the cabin seemed to exhale. Conversations resumed, softer now, more thoughtful. A child laughed in the row behind. Someone started a movie. The normal rhythms of flight life returned, but with a new awareness humming beneath the surface. The woman sipped her water when it came. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She just sat there, a person again, not a symbol, not a threat, just a woman going home after a long week of doing a difficult job. But she knew this wasn't over. Not really. The man might apologize. He might stay silent for the rest of the flight, but the real reckoning would come on the ground. And she was ready for that too. She reached into her carry-on and pulled out a small notebook. Not official, just a personal one with a worn cover. She flipped to a fresh page and began writing in neat, precise handwriting. Time, flight number, seat locations, exact quotes, witness descriptions. She didn't write out of anger. She wrote because facts mattered. Because if this ever went further, if it became a report, an investigation, a policy review, she wanted the truth to be clear, clean and undeniable. Outside, the sky darkened as the plane crossed into evening. Stars began to prick through the deep blue. The world below disappeared into shadow, but up here, in this pressurized bubble of light and metal, something important had shifted, not because of a badge, but because one woman refused to be made small, and in doing so, reminded everyone around her that respect isn't given based on how someone looks. It's earned by how they carry themselves. And she carried herself like someone who knew her worth. No announcement was made. No dramatic music swelled. Just the steady hum of engines, the soft clink of ice in a cup, and the quiet certainty that for now, justice didn't need a spotlight. It just needed to be seen. The rest of the flight passed in a strange kind of quiet. Not the tense silence from before, but something softer, almost respectful. People still read, still watched movies, still dozed off, but there was a new awareness in the air. Like everyone had just witnessed something real, something that mattered. No one made a big show of it. No one clapped or stood up. But glances were exchanged. Small nods, quiet smiles, tiny gestures that said, "I saw that. I saw you." The man in the aisle seat never looked up again. He kept his head down, fingers twisting the edge of his boarding pass into a tight spiral. Every so often, he'd shift in his seat like he was trying to disappear into the cushion. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't ask for a drink, didn't even touch the meal that was served. He just sat there, wrapped in the heavy cloak of his own regret, or maybe just embarrassment. It was hard to tell which was worse. The woman in 12A didn't gloat. She didn't stare at him or make him feel worse than he already did. She simply existed, calm, present, unshaken. She finished her water, tucked her notebook back into her bag, and leaned her head against the window. The cool glass felt grounding. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly, dotted with stars that seemed close enough to touch. She let her mind drift not to the confrontation, but to what waited for her at home. The soft weight of her cat curling into her lap, the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the quiet joy of being alone in a space that was entirely hers. But even in that peace, she knew the flight wasn't the end of the story. What happened at 35,000 feet would land with them on the ground, and she was ready for that. About 20 minutes before touchdown, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into Washington, D.C. Please return your seats to the upright position and fasten your seatbelts." As the plane tilted downward, the cabin lights brightened. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, collecting trash, stowing carts, making sure everything was secure. Maria passed by again and gave the woman in 12A a small, knowing look. No words needed. The purser stood near the front, arms crossed, eyes scanning the cabin with quiet vigilance. She'd already radioed ahead. Security would be waiting. The man in the aisle seat finally stirred. He fumbled with his seatbelt, then stood up abruptly as if he couldn't bear to sit still another second. He paced near the galley for a moment before one of the attendants gently but firmly told him to return to his seat for landing. He obeyed without argument, his earlier bluster completely gone. When the wheels touched down at Reagan National, the usual murmur of relief rippled through the cabin, seatbelts clicking open, phones powering on, the rustle of people gathering their things. But in row 12, no one moved right away. The woman stayed seated, watching as the man beside her gathered his briefcase with trembling hands. He wouldn't look at her. Couldn't, maybe. When he finally stood to exit, he paused for just a second as if he wanted to say something. His mouth opened slightly. Perhaps an apology hovered on his lips. But then he thought better of it. He just walked away, shoulders hunched, disappearing into the stream of passengers filing toward the jet bridge. She waited until the aisle cleared a little before standing herself. She took her time, straightening her blazer, smoothing her hair, slinging her carry-on over her shoulder. She wasn't rushing. She had work to do. As she stepped off the plane, she saw them right away. Two airport police officers standing just outside the jet bridge entrance, speaking quietly with a gate agent. They spotted her immediately. One of them, a woman with short gray hair and a no-nonsense posture, stepped forward. "Ma'am?" she said, voice low and professional. "We were told you might need to speak with us." The woman nodded. Yes, there was an incident on the flight. They moved to a quiet corner near the gate, away from the flow of deplaning passengers. She gave her account clearly and calmly. No exaggeration, no emotion, just facts. Time of the first comment. Exact words used, escalation, the public accusation. The racial undertones. The moment she revealed her credentials. She mentioned the flight attendants by description, noted which passengers seemed to witness key moments, and handed over her personal notes. The officers listened without interrupting. They'd heard versions of this before, too many times. But they took it seriously. One of them radioed the airline's security liaison, while the other asked if she wanted to file an official report. She said yes. While they worked, she watched the last passengers trickle off the plane. Among them, she saw the man being approached by another officer. He froze when he saw the uniform, his face going pale again. He didn't resist as he was led away, not to handcuffs, not to a cell, but to a small office near the gate for questioning. He kept his head down the whole time. She felt no satisfaction in that. No triumph, just a quiet sense of necessity. This wasn't about punishing him. It was about making sure it didn't happen again. To her, or to someone else who wouldn't have a badge to flash. An airline representative arrived soon after, a man in a dark suit with a concerned expression that looked practiced but not insincere. He introduced himself as part of customer relations and said the airline had already been briefed. "We take incidents like this extremely seriously," he said. "We're launching an internal review, and we'll be reaching out to all crew members for statements. We'd also like to offer you a formal apology, and whatever support you need moving forward." She appreciated the gesture, but she knew words weren't enough. "What matters," she said evenly, "is what changes after this. Training, policies, how you handle bias when it shows up in real time." He nodded quickly. "Absolutely. We're already discussing enhanced anti-bias protocols with our leadership team, and we'll be reviewing this flight's audio and any passenger footage that's shared." She didn't mention the videos she knew were probably already circulating online. That wasn't her concern. Her job was truth, not virality. After finishing her statement, she was free to go. The officers thanked her for her cooperation. The airline rep offered a voucher for future travel, which she politely declined. "Just do better," she said. "That's payment enough." She walked through the terminal toward baggage claim, though she had no checked bags. The fluorescent lights, the squeak of rolling suitcases, the distant echo of announcements. It all felt surreal after the intensity of the flight. She pulled out her phone. 3 missed calls from her office, a text from her sister, "You okay? Saw something weird online?" and a flood of notifications from news alerts she hadn't even opened yet. She turned off the alerts. She wasn't ready for that noise. Instead, she found a quiet bench near an empty gate and sat down. For the first time all day, she let herself breathe deeply. Her shoulders relaxed. Her hands, which had been clenched in her pockets, finally uncurled. A few minutes later, an elderly woman with a floral scarf and a rolling suitcase stopped in front of her. She didn't say much, just smiled warmly and placed a small, wrapped piece of chocolate on the bench beside her. "For your strength," she said softly, then walked on without waiting for a reply. The woman picked up the chocolate. It was a simple gesture, but it carried more weight than any official apology. It was human. Real. A quiet, "I see you" from one stranger to another. She unwrapped it and let it melt slowly on her tongue. Sweet, smooth grounding. Back at the gate, she heard snippets of conversation as people passed by. "Can you believe that guy?" She handled it so calmly. "Oh, glad someone finally stood up to that nonsense." She didn't turn to look. She just sat there, letting the moment settle into her bones. This wasn't the first time she'd faced prejudice. It probably wouldn't be the last. But today, she hadn't just defended herself, she'd reminded everyone watching that dignity doesn't need permission. That authority isn't about volume or anger, but about presence, about showing up as you are and refusing to shrink. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her supervisor. She answered, "Hey, she said, voice tired but steady. Yeah, I'm on the ground. Everything's okay. She listened for a moment, then added, No, I don't need time off. It's okay. Maybe we should talk about how often this happens to agents in the field, especially the ones who don't look like the old photos on the FBI website. There was a pause on the other end. Then a quiet, You're right. We'll talk tomorrow. She hung up and stood. The terminal was quieter now, the rush of deplaning travelers fading into the hum of late-night operations. She walked toward the exit, her steps lighter than when she'd boarded that morning. Outside, the DC air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. A taxi waited at the curb. She gave the driver her address and leaned back in the seat as the city lights blurred past the window. She didn't know what would come next, the airline's investigation, the possible charges, the online chatter, but none of that belonged to her anymore. She'd done her part, spoken her truth, held her ground, and in the end, that was all anyone could ask of her. As the taxi turned onto her street, she saw her building's familiar brick facade. Her window was dark, but she knew her cat would be waiting by the door, tail flicking with impatience. For the first time in days, she felt like she could finally rest, not because the world had changed, but because she hadn't let it change. For the days after the flight unfolded, like pages turning in a book no one expected to read, but everyone wanted to finish. At first it was quiet, just paperwork, phone calls, and the slow, steady work of official channels doing what they were supposed to do. The woman returned to her routine, morning coffee, checking secure messages, reviewing case files, walking her cat around the apartment like it was a tiny patrol route. She didn't check social media, didn't watch the news. She needed space to breathe before the world caught up with what had happened in the sky. But the world had already caught up. By the third day, a short clip, filmed discreetly by a passenger 2 rows back, began circulating online. It showed the man standing in the aisle, voice raised, pointing towards seat 12A. Then came the calm reply, the slow reach into the blazer, the flash of the badge. The video was only 47 seconds long, but it spread like wildfire. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. No music, no editing, just truth, raw and unfiltered. News outlets picked it up. Not the sensational kind that twist stories for clicks, but the serious ones, the ones that still believed facts mattered. They interviewed flight attendants with permission, spoke to airline spokespeople, and tried repeatedly to reach the woman herself. She declined every request, not out of fear, but because she didn't want this to be about her. She wanted it to be about the pattern, not the person. Still, people talked. In offices, on buses, in group chats and family dinners. The story became a reference point. Remember that FBI agent on the plane? Someone would say, and others would nod because they did remember. They remembered the quiet strength, the way she didn't yell, the way she didn't shrink, the way she simply said, I suggest you voice it to the proper authorities, and then proved she was the proper authority. The airline didn't stay silent. Within a week, they issued a formal statement. They apologized not just to her, but to all passengers who've ever felt unwelcome because of how they looked. They announced mandatory anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff, including pilots and gate agents. They also revealed they'd permanently banned the man from flying with them again, and shared his information with a national aviation security network that tracks disruptive passengers. It wasn't punishment in the legal sense, but it was consequence, and it sent a message. As for the man himself, he wasn't arrested. Federal harassment charges require a high bar, proof of intent, repeated behavior, clear threat. And while his actions were ugly and rooted in prejudice, they didn't meet that threshold. But he wasn't let off easy. The FBI's Office of Equal Employment Opportunity opened an internal review. Not because she demanded it, but because the Bureau recognized this wasn't just a personal slight. It was a workplace issue. Agents, especially those from underrepresented groups, shouldn't have to prove their legitimacy while off duty, just to sit in a seat they paid for. She submitted her full report, along with the notes she'd taken mid-flight. Her supervisor read it in silence, then looked up and said, This happens more than we admit, doesn't it? She just nodded. They both knew the answer. A few weeks later, the Bureau held a closed-door forum for agents of color. Not a lecture, not a performance, just a space to talk about the stares in the field, the double takes at headquarters, the times they'd been mistaken for suspects instead of colleagues. She didn't speak much, but she listened. And in that room, she realized she wasn't alone. Her story had opened a door others had been too tired to knock on. Still, she kept her head down at work. She took on a new case, a financial fraud ring operating across 3 states, and threw herself into it with the same focus she always did. Because that's who she was, not a symbol, not a headline, a professional who showed up, did the work, and expected to be treated like anyone else. Then came the interview request she couldn't ignore. It wasn't from a national network or a flashy podcast. It was from a small local DC news station known for thoughtful community reporting. The producer wrote a handwritten note, scanned and emailed, but still. We don't want drama. We want understanding. If you're willing to share what this moment meant, not just for you but for others who've been made to feel out of place, we'd be honored. She thought about it for 2 days. Walked around the block 7 times. Talked to her sister. Finally, she said yes, but with conditions. No dramatic lighting. No leading questions. Just a quiet conversation. The interview happened in a sunlit studio with plain walls and 2 chairs. The reporter was older, with kind eyes and a voice that sounded like someone who'd listened to a lot of hard stories and still believed in people. They didn't start with the flight. They started with her. How did you decide to join the Bureau? The reporter asked. She smiled faintly. Because I believed in fairness. In protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. I still do. They talked about training, about the weight of the badge, about the difference between authority and arrogance. Then, gently, they came to the flight. What went through your mind, the reporter asked, when he said you didn't belong? She paused. Looked out the studio window at a tree swaying in the breeze. I thought about all the times I've heard that before, in school, in stores, in meetings. And I thought, not today. Not while I'm going home after doing work that matters. She didn't call him names, didn't mock him. She simply said, I wear this badge not for power but for protection. For everyone, even those who doubt me. The segment aired on a Sunday morning. It wasn't flashy. No dramatic music. Just her voice, calm and clear, telling the truth. People called the station afterward, teachers, nurses, delivery drivers, all saying the same thing. That could have been me. Online, the comments were different this time. Less about the gotcha moment, more about reflection. Makes me think about how I react when I see someone who looks different, one wrote. We need more people like her with strength and grace, said another. The Bureau didn't make her a poster child. They didn't parade her around. But quietly, her story became part of their internal training modules, used not to shame, but to teach. To show new recruits that bias can show up anywhere, even at 35,000 feet, and that responding with dignity is its own kind of courage. Months passed. Life settled back into rhythm. She got promoted not because of the incident, but because of her work. She adopted a second cat. She started gardening on her tiny balcony, growing herbs that smelled like home. One evening, as she watered her basil, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Maria, the flight attendant. Just a photo. A group of crew members in uniform holding a certificate for completing the airline's new anti-bias training. At the bottom, handwritten, because of you, we're better. She smiled. Didn't reply right away. Just saved the photo and went back to her plants. She never saw the man again. Never wanted to. But she hoped quietly, without expectation, that he'd learned something. Not just about her, but about himself. Because real change doesn't come from shame. It comes from seeing clearly. Years later, when young agents asked her for advice, she'd say the same thing. Do your job with integrity. Stand tall even when no one's watching. And never let anyone make you feel like you have to prove you belong. Because if you're doing the work, you already do. The story of the flight didn't end with a grand finale. No courtroom drama. No viral fame. Just a woman going about her life, carrying the quiet weight of being seen, and choosing every day to keep showing up anyway. And in the end, that was the most powerful thing of all.